of them to come up with at least 3 practical things they would like to see, either themselves, commitments they would like to make either for themselves or for us as an organization, as a group of people to move forward over the next year. So we'll wait to see what those practical outcomes are. But much more importantly, I think the idea is to, irrespective of what comes out of those outcomes, is to sustain the momentum that we've developed out of this conference. We surveyed 140 young Africans. Many of them got involved in organizing the conference and played very critical roles. Many of them are facilitating the workshops, and we went through a process of training and working with them leading up to this conference. So we hope to sustain that involvement that we have begun, and try to talk to some other organizations about how they could get that as well. That's one very practical outcome. The other is, obviously, we look forward to next year. We'll produce a report which we will distribute and much more widely to those who haven't attended the conference, so that people can take on board the issues.
Philip has been described as the Bill Gates of Africa, and he has actually won and been awarded several accolades for his huge, tremendous contribution to the development of the internet. In fact, he's given credit for developing, I believe, the fastest computer that there is in the world at the minute. That Philip is currently consulting on the next generation of supercomputers, supercomputing, and the internet, and that his most prestigious award was being given the Gordon Bell Prize, presented to him by the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers in 1989. And just before I round up, just to quickly say, that is on top of already being described as America's best and brightest inventor in 1996, and the Computer Scientist of the Year by American National Technical Association in 1993.
We are here today to look forward to the future. Yet, as Patrice said, and to paraphrase him, we cannot look forward to our future unless we look backward to our past. 500 years ago, most people of African descent lived in Africa. Today, 1 in 5 persons of African descent live outside Africa. 1 million British citizens are of African descent, and 40 million American citizens are of African descent, and 60 million Brazilian citizens are of African descent. And 2 days ago, when I met Onyekachi Wambu for the first time, he made a comment that I found very revealing. He told me, the biggest foreign investors and aid donors to Africa are diasporan Africans. And that's very interesting, because many people like myself assume that it's the World Bank and other donor agencies.
Well, they won't replace IMF and World Bank loans, because in fact they are used differently. You find that a lot of the remittances, they do get to the households. They are people sending money either to individuals or to communities. So you actually have one-to-one, like your family individually, but also people are coming together collectively to support and do things. But to be honest with you, that money does something very different to what the IMF and World Bank money does. The IMF and World Bank money is an intergovernmental or a multilateral sort of arrangement. And so you find actually typically that the governments, the African governments, are much more focused on the question of those sorts of monies, because they have a certain type of accountability, and that money goes into their coffers, not necessarily directly into their pockets, but into the national coffers, whereas remittances, a lot of the time, as we know, bypass the national treasuries and so on. But I think the reality is that it is like an international, a global welfare system. See, because if we didn't have the remittances, imagine how many people would suffer. You see, because that money, I mean, sometimes that's what's getting people into schools. That's what's actually enabling people to buy food. That's what's enabling people to actually participate in society and to survive. And that is critical, and that's not coming from the government. There's no welfare state in Africa, or very few African countries have a welfare state. So these are two separate types of monies, but you know, they're both important. I suppose what we would say is that, I mean, you know, remittances, for the limited amount of money that the World Bank and the IMF and even the bilateral donors offer, they get enormous amount of influence. You know, so you have a British minister, for instance, can actually really influence policy in parts of Africa, whereas you and I, sending our $100 a month, so to speak, we haven't got that type of influence unless we get together, unless we organise, unless we act collectively. That's what we've got to do, and that's a key thing here. We have to organise together. We have to come together to work, to build institutions that can channel and chart our own development in a sustainable way.
What we're trying to highlight here is that the fact that the amount that Africans send is very huge and tends never to be put in the equation, and we need to put it in the equation because it's important that all those other people who are contributing to Africa, when they make their contributions, they demand influence, and the only people who don't demand influence are the diaspora, and yet we say send a lot of money. So I think it's important, and the first thing that you can do is to acknowledge that the money is going and that these contributions are being made. And the next stage is to start beginning to talk about what kind of influence that buys.
President of Ghana himself was here and he met with a group of Ghanaians, and he did say that for last year alone, monies that the Bank of Ghana had actually been able to trace, monies from the diaspora into Ghana, was as much as about $1.3 billion.
But yet, even though foreign remittances is becoming a major source of income for Africa, the brain drain from Africa is a far greater loss than what Africa is gaining from the foreign remittances. I'll give you an example. Many of my Nigerian friends in the US that I know who are nurses working in the IT field typically send like $300 a month to their mom and dad in Nigeria. But yet, that is a small fraction of the potential contribution they will be doing if they were to be working in Nigeria. According to the United Nations, the average African professional in the United States contribute about $150,000 a year to the US economy. And when you compare $150,000 a year, that is almost 100 times greater than $300 a month many people are remitting. So the issue of brain drain is a far more serious one than it creates a greater loss to Africa than what Africa is gaining through foreign remittances from Africans in the diaspora. If you look at Kenya, the top Kenyan scholars are outside Kenya. Ali Mazuri and the writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o, they both live and work in New York City. And the same thing with Congolese soukous musicians. Most of them, you will find more of them in Paris than in Kinshasa. And yet, we don't fully address this problem in Africa, in the New African Union's NEPAD, which is essentially a document about reform and trade. NEPAD focuses on reform and trade, and in the midst of that lengthy document, we tend to forget what is the root of the problem that we have in Africa. And the root of the problem is education and knowledge, especially the lack of technological knowledge. A consequence of the lack of technological knowledge in Africa is that we have a constant capital flight from Africa to the Western world. Nigeria exports crude petroleum only to import refined petroleum. Africa exports raw steel only to import steel products such as car. The only difference between raw steel and steel product is brain power. but they're essentially the same.